I am Sloane, 35 years old, and today I buried my husband Griffin in Singapore. After 30 grueling hours of travel back to Portland, exhausted beyond measure, I pulled out my phone at the baggage claim. My hands trembled as I typed a simple message to our family group chat. Flight just landed at 5 p.m. Can someone please pick me up? The response came within seconds. Wyatt, my younger brother, replied first. We're all busy tonight. Just grab an Uber. Then my mother, Nadine, added her own twist of the knife. Why didn't you plan this better, Sloane? You know we have commitments. With shaking fingers, I typed back, no worries, while something inside me shattered into 1,000 pieces. I had no idea that within hours, my entire family would be watching my tragedy unfold on their television screens, their phones dropping from their hands in shock. But before I continue this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt completely abandoned when you needed someone the most? Have you ever realized that the people who should care about you simply don't? Hit that subscribe button if you've ever discovered that family isn't always who you're born to, but who shows up when life falls apart. Before grief rewrote my entire existence, I had what anyone would consider a beautiful life. Griffin and I met during our junior year at Portland State University. He accidentally knocked my entire coffee onto my laptop in the library, destroying 3 weeks of research. Most people would have been furious, but Griffin's genuine panic and insistence on not only replacing my laptop but helping me recreate all my lost work turned disaster into destiny. We spent the next 72 hours straight together, and by the end, I knew I'd found my person. We married 2 years after. Graduation in a small ceremony at the coast. I worked as a financial analyst while Griffin built his reputation as a software architect. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs with a yard I transformed into my personal garden paradise. Griffin always said my roses could win competitions if I ever had the courage to enter them. You nurture everything you touch, he would tell me, kissing my dirt-covered hands after a day of planting. Even me. 12 years of marriage passed like a beautiful dream that you never want to wake from. We traveled whenever possible, exploring national parks and small towns that weren't in any guidebooks. Saturday mornings meant farmers markets and terrible attempts at recreating cooking shows. Sunday evenings were for planning our future, discussing the children we'd have once Griffin's career was more established. We had even started converting the spare bedroom, painting it a soft yellow that would work for any gender. Everything changed when Griffin received an offer from a tech giant to lead a 6-month project in Singapore. The opportunity was massive, a career-defining moment that would set us up financially for the family we planned to start. The company would cover all expenses, provide a furnished apartment, and the bonus alone would pay off our mortgage. I arranged to work remotely for 3 months, planning to spend half the time with him abroad. The night before his departure, I cooked his favorite meal. We sat on our back deck, the October air crisp with approaching winter, and talked until 3 a.m. 6 months will fly by, Griffin promised, pulling me closer under the blanket we shared. And when I come back, we'll finally be ready for everything we've dreamed about. I can feel it, Sloane. This is the beginning of our real adventure. For the first 2 months, we video called twice a day. Morning and evening, no matter the time difference. I flew out for 3 weeks during Thanksgiving, and Singapore amazed me with its blend of cultures and endless summer. Griffin showed me hidden food courts where locals ate, introduced me to his international team who already adored him, and we spent weekends island hopping to places with water so clear you could see your feet 10 feet down. We were actively trying for a baby during that visit, confident that we'd have good news to share soon. Then came the call that split my life into before and after. I was preparing for a morning presentation when Griffin called earlier than usual, his face drawn on the screen. Just a headache, he said, rubbing his temples. Probably pushing too hard on this deadline. The team needs the prototype by Friday. I told him to take some aspirin and rest. Those were the last words I ever spoke to my husband while he was conscious. 8 hours later, my phone rang with Griffin's number, but it wasn't his voice. His colleague Mitchell explained in halting English mixed with panic that Griffin had collapsed during a code review. The words hospital and emergency and you should come blurred together as my legs gave out. I booked the next available flight while still on the phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. 26 hours of flights and layovers, and running through airports, and by the time I reached Singapore General Hospital, Griffin was already in a coma. Severe brain aneurysm, Dr. Kwan explained with practiced gentleness. We performed emergency surgery, but the bleeding was extensive. The damage. He trailed off, but his eyes told me everything. They had done all they could, but medicine has limits that love cannot cross. For 5 days, I lived in a chair beside Griffin's bed. I held his hand, feeling for any pressure back. I talked until my voice went hoarse, telling him about the roses blooming back home, about the neighbor's new puppy, about anything except goodbye. I played his favorite songs and read emails from his team, all praying for a miracle that we already knew wouldn't come. Griffin never opened his eyes again. He slipped away on a Thursday afternoon, the machines going quiet one by one as the sun set over Singapore's skyline. He was 37 years old, healthy and strong until the moment his brain betrayed him. The future we planned, the children we wanted, the years we assumed we had, all of it ended in a sterile room 10,000 miles from home. The nightmare of handling death in a foreign country while drowning in grief is something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Every form required translation. Every process needed explanation through hospital interpreters who meant well, but couldn't translate the weight of loss. I called my family back in Portland daily, desperate for any emotional support, but our conversations lasted mere minutes. "We're praying for you," Nadine would say before explaining why she needed to rush off the phone. "The Johnsons are coming for dinner." My father, Vernon, would clear his throat and mention something about work being busy. Wyatt usually didn't answer at all, texting later that he was in meetings. "Have you looked into travel insurance?" my mother asked during one call, while I sat in the hospital morgue trying to understand paperwork written in 3 languages. "This must be costing a fortune. Your father is worried about the expense." Not about me, not about Griffin, but about the money. I wanted to scream that Griffin was dead, that money was meaningless when your entire future had just flatlined, but I just said I'd handle it and hung up. The logistics of death in Singapore were overwhelming. The death certificate alone required 5 different offices, each with their own requirements and waiting periods. I spent 3 full days going from building to building in the crushing humidity, carrying documents that proved my husband existed, that we were married, that he had died, that I had the right to claim his body. Each stamp and signature felt like another goodbye, another admission that this was real and permanent. I had to make an impossible decision about Griffin's remains. The cost to transport his body back to Portland was $32,000, more than we had in savings after paying for the medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover internationally. Cremation was cheaper, but the thought of reducing Griffin to ash felt like losing him all over again. After agonizing for days, I chose burial in Singapore. At least there would be a place, a spot on Earth where he rested, even if it was an ocean away from home. "Can't you just have him cremated and come home?" Wyatt asked when I told him about the burial plans. "It seems like you're making this harder than it needs to be." The casual cruelty of his words hit me like physical blows. Making this harder? As if there was an easy way to bury your husband alone in a country where you knew no one, where even ordering food was a struggle through grief-fogged confusion. The funeral was small and quiet. 7 of Griffin's colleagues attended, along with 3 expat families he'd befriended at his apartment complex. No family, no childhood friends, no one who knew about his fear of spiders or his secret love for reality cooking shows. I stood at his graveside in a black dress I'd bought at a Singapore mall because I hadn't packed funeral clothes for what was supposed to be a working vacation. I asked my family one more time if anyone could come, even just for the funeral. The flights weren't that expensive if booked last minute, I lied, willing to pay for them myself if it meant not standing at Griffin's grave alone. Nadine said she couldn't leave her book club's annual fundraiser that she'd been planning for months. Vernon claimed his back couldn't handle the long flight. Wyatt had a presentation for a potential promotion that he couldn't reschedule. Each excuse perfectly reasonable on its own, collectively painting a picture I'd been refusing to see for 35 years. After the burial, I spent 3 more days in Singapore settling Griffin's affairs. His company was generous, providing a grief counselor and helping with paperwork, showing more compassion than my blood relatives. They packed his personal items from the office, small things that shouldn't have mattered but did desperately. His coffee mug with the faded Portland Trail Blazers logo. The stress ball shaped like a brain that he'd squeeze during difficult debugging sessions. A photo of us from our anniversary trip to Crater Lake, both of us smiling like we knew something. Wonderful that the rest of the world didn't. The apartment Griffin had been living in was sterile and temporary, but I found pieces of him everywhere. Grocery lists in his handwriting stuck to the refrigerator. His running shoes by the door, still dirty from his last jog through East Coast Park. The indent on his side of the bed that somehow still smelled like his shampoo. I packed everything. I could fit into 3 suitcases, choosing items by their emotional weight rather than practical value. His favorite t-shirt from college, soft and full of holes. The watch I'd given him for our 10th anniversary. Every ticket stub and receipt that proved he had been here, living and planning to come home. On my last morning in Singapore, I visited Griffin's grave one final time. The cemetery opened at dawn, and I was the only living person among the neat rows of the dead. I sat on the grass, still damp with dew, and talked to the fresh marble headstone as if Griffin could hear me. I told him about the flight home, about how scared I was to return to our empty house, about how I didn't know how to be Sloane without Griffin. I promised to tend the roses, to live somehow, to carry him with me in whatever way I could manage. "Have to go," I finally whispered, pressing my palm against the cold stone. "But leaving you here feels like tearing myself in half. How do I do this? How do I get on a plane and leave you in the ground on the other side of the world?" There was no answer except the morning birds and the distant sound of city traffic. Griffin was gone, and I had to go home to a life that no longer made sense without him. The taxi to the airport was waiting, meter running, while I sat frozen in a foreign cemetery, trying to find the strength to stand up and walk away from the spot where I'd left my heart buried in Singapore soil. My journey home stretched across 30 excruciating hours of delays, missed connections, and turbulence both literal and emotional. First, a 6-hour delay in Singapore due to mechanical issues that left me sitting at the gate, surrounded by irritated travelers who had no idea that every extra minute in this country felt like torture. Then a missed connection in Tokyo that required an overnight stay in an airport hotel where I couldn't sleep, just stared at the ceiling and listened to planes taking off toward destinations that no longer mattered to me. The final leg from Tokyo to Portland included turbulence, so severe that even the flight attendants looked nervous. I gripped the armrests and thought about how ironic it would be to die in a plane crash just days after burying Griffin. Part of me almost welcomed the idea, then immediately felt guilty for the thought. Griffin would want me to live, to find some way forward, but wanting and managing felt like opposite shores of an impossible ocean. During those endless hours in the air, I kept checking my phone whenever we had Wi-Fi, sending updates to the family group chat. Delayed in Singapore. Then hours later, missed connection in Tokyo won't arrive until tomorrow afternoon. Each message was read immediately. I could see the little check marks, but no one replied except with occasional thumb emoji reactions. Nadine hearted the message about my delay, as if there was something to love about your daughter being stuck in an airport after burying her husband. 3 days before my final flight home, I had messaged our family group chat with my complete itinerary, flight numbers, and arrival times clearly stated. The responses were minimal, but I'd assumed foolishly that when the moment came, someone would be there. Vernon had sent back a thumbs up. Nadine asked if I was bringing back any of those fancy Asian face masks she liked. Wyatt wanted to know if I'd grabbed any tech from Singapore's electronics markets, apparently forgetting why I'd been there in the first place, as I'd. The plane began its descent into Portland. I sent one more message to the group chat. Landing in 20 minutes. Gate C7. Baggage claim 3. I watched the typing indicators appear and disappear multiple times before Wyatt's response came through. Can't make it. Client emergency. Try Uber or Lyft. Before I could even process that, Nadine added her own special brand of salt to the wound. Honestly, Sloane, you should have arranged transportation in advance. You know how busy Fridays are for everyone. Poor planning on your part doesn't constitute an emergency on ours. I stared at my phone screen until the words blurred. Poor planning. I had just planned my husband's funeral alone in a foreign country, navigated international death certificates, and traveled for 30 hours straight, and my mother was lecturing me about poor planning. With trembling fingers that had nothing to do with the plane's landing, I typed back simply, "No worries. I understand." Though I understood nothing, except that my family's capacity for cruelty had depths I'd never imagined. Portland International Airport buzzed with typical Friday afternoon chaos as I made my way through customs. The fluorescent lights felt like needles in my exhausted eyes, and every announcement over the intercom made me flinch. I moved through the terminal on autopilot, my body present while my mind remained thousands of miles away, sitting beside a grave under frangipani trees. The familiar signs in English felt foreign after weeks of navigating Singapore's multi-language landscape. I stood at baggage claim 3, watching suitcases circle endlessly on the conveyor belt like some metaphor for grief I was too tired to fully form. My bags were easy to identify. One large black suitcase with my clothes, 2 others stuffed with Griffin's belongings that I couldn't bear to leave behind. His things were heavier than my own, or maybe that was just the weight of carrying someone's memory in fabric and paper, and the small objects that somehow contain an entire life. Another message buzzed in the family group chat. I opened it with the last shred of hope I didn't know I still had. Wyatt had written, "Seriously, sis, we can't just drop everything because you didn't plan ahead. This is why adults make arrangements." Nadine followed with, "Your father and I have dinner with the Mitchells tonight. We've had these reservations for weeks. It's their anniversary celebration." Vernon, true to form, added only, "Weather says rain starting soon. Drive carefully if you get a rental." Not a single question about how I was doing. Not one word of comfort about Griffin. Not even a perfunctory "sorry for your loss" that strangers had been offering for days. Just criticism, excuses, and a weather report. I stood there in the middle of baggage claim, surrounded by reuniting families and joyful welcomes, and felt more alone than I had in Singapore, where at least strangers had shown kindness. An elderly Japanese woman at the Tokyo airport had hugged me when she saw me crying. The Singapore taxi driver had refused to take payment for the cemetery trip. Strangers had shown more humanity than my blood relatives. The weight of the suitcases made me stagger as I loaded them onto a cart. One wheel stuck immediately, that broken wheel that always exists on airport carts, making every step a struggle. As I fought to control the cart toward the exit, the top suitcase shifted and crashed to the ground, bursting open and spilling Griffin's belongings across the polished airport floor. His blue Columbia University sweatshirt, his running shoes still traced with Singapore mud, the leather journal I'd given him last Christmas, filled with code notes and project ideas in his precise handwriting. I dropped to my knees frantically, gathering his things as tears I'd been holding back for 30 hours finally broke free. Other travelers stepped around me, some annoyed at the obstacle, others deliberately looking away from my obvious distress. I was sobbing openly now, clutching Griffin's shirt to my chest, unable to pretend anymore that I was okay, or managing, or any of the lies we tell ourselves to keep functioning. "Let me help you, honey." The voice was soft and kind, and I looked up to see an airport employee, her name tag reading Beverly, kneeling beside me. She had silver hair and gentle eyes that reminded me of my grandmother, who died when I was 12, the only family member who'd ever really seen me. Beverly didn't ask questions, just helped me. "Is someone coming for you, sweetheart?" she asked, and something about the way she said it, like she already knew the answer, broke me all over again. "No," I whispered. "My family is busy. They said to take an Uber." Beverly's expression shifted through several emotions, settling on a mixture of sadness and anger that she tried to hide. "I just buried my husband," I heard myself saying, as if explaining to this stranger might make it make sense. "In Singapore, alone, and they couldn't even come to the airport." Beverly stayed with me until the rideshare arrived, personally helping load my luggage and pressing a small packet of tissues into my hand. "You take care of yourself, sweetheart," she said, squeezing my shoulder. "And remember, family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up." Her words would prove more prophetic than either of us could have imagined in that moment. The rideshare driver, an older man named Dennis, made polite conversation as we navigated through Portland's Friday evening traffic. The rain Vernon had mentioned started falling, turning the city into a blur of brake lights and water-streaked windows. When Dennis asked about my trip, I gave vague answers, afraid that speaking the truth would shatter whatever thin shell was holding me together. He seemed to sense my fragility and turned on soft jazz, occasionally pointing out new construction or changed storefronts, filling the silence without demanding participation. The fare came to $86 due to surge pricing and traffic. I tipped Dennis probably too much, but he'd helped with the suitcases without being asked, and hadn't complained when I'd started crying silently in the back seat. As we pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly as I'd left it 6 weeks. Ego, yet completely alien. The porch light I'd asked Nadine to leave on was dark. The mail overflowed from the box, wet and ruined from days of rain. The lawn had grown wild, despite Wyatt's promise to have his landscaping guy maintain it. Dennis helped carry my luggage to the porch, and as he set down the last bag, he hesitated. "Ma'am, are you sure you're okay? You seem like you might need someone." I assured him I was fine, though we both knew I was lying. After his taillights disappeared down the street, I stood on my own porch like a stranger, fumbling with keys in the dark, trying to remember which one opened the door to a life that no longer existed. The house was freezing. I could see my breath in the entryway, which meant the temperature had been dropping for days. I'd specifically asked my mother to adjust the thermostat before my return, a simple task that would have taken her 5 minutes since she had a spare key. The heat had been off so long that the walls themselves felt like ice when I touched them. Every surface radiated cold like the house itself had died in Griffin's absence. The smell hit me next, something musty and wrong that made my stomach turn. The refrigerator, I realized with dull horror. The power must have gone out at some point, and everything inside had spoiled. I opened it to find a science experiment of mold and decay. The milk had separated into something unrecognizable. The leftovers from our last meal together before Griffin left were now black with rot. Even the condiments had exploded or leaked, creating a toxic soup in the drawers. Another promise broken, Wyatt had sworn he'd clean out the fridge and stock, some basics for my return. Too exhausted to deal with any of it, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, each step feeling like ascending Everest. The bed was exactly as I'd left it, Griffin's pillow still bearing the indent of his head from his last night home. His reading glasses sat on the nightstand next to the book he'd been halfway through, a thriller he'd now never finish. I couldn't bring myself to lie in our bed, couldn't face that expanse of cold sheets where Griffin would never be again. Instead, I curled up in the reading chair by the window, still wearing my coat because the house was so cold. I pulled one of Griffin's suitcases close and opened it, breathing in the faint scent of Singapore that still clung to his clothes. His Columbia sweatshirt became my blanket, his running shoes my strange comfort, positioned where I could see them and remember that he'd been real, that our life together hadn't been just a dream I'd now woken from into this nightmare. I must have dozed off because I woke to a strange sound from downstairs, a gurgling, rushing noise that didn't belong. My phone showed 3:17 a.m., and the house was even colder if that was possible. I could actually see ice forming on the inside of the windows. Stiff from sleeping in the chair, still disoriented from travel and grief, I made my way downstairs, toward the sound that grew louder with each step. When I flipped on the kitchen light, I gasped. Water poured from a massive crack in the ceiling, cascading down the walls and pooling across the tile floor. The pipe had burst, probably frozen, in the cold and then split open, and now my kitchen was becoming an indoor lake. The water was already 3 inches deep and rising, seeping under the hardwood floors in the dining room, causing them to buckle and warp with sounds like breaking bones. I splashed through the freezing water to reach the utility closet, my socks. Immediately soaked, my feet going numb. The main water shutoff valve was so cold it burned my fingers and it took all my strength to turn it. After what felt like hours but was probably minutes, the flow finally stopped, but the damage was done. Water dripped from light fixtures, creating puddles that sparked occasionally, warning of electrical danger. The drywall sagged like wet paper, and I could hear water running through the walls, finding every path down to pool in places I couldn't even see. My first call was to an emergency plumber. The answering service informed me they were completely booked with similar emergencies due to the cold snap. Tuesday at the earliest, the dispatcher said, sounding genuinely apologetic. This weather has everyone's pipes bursting. You might want to call your insurance company and find somewhere else to stay. That much water damage isn't safe, especially with the electrical issues. My second call was to Wyatt. He answered on the fifth ring, his voice thick with annoyance and sleep. Sloane, it's 3 a.m. This better be an actual emergency. When I explained about the burst pipe and flooding, his response was a study in irritated inconvenience. Well, that sucks. Did you try turning off the water? As if I was too stupid to think of that myself. When I asked if I could stay with him until it was fixed, the silence stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Look, tonight's really not good, he finally said. Bethany and I are having her parents over tomorrow, and the guest room is full of her crafting supplies for her Etsy business. Have you called Mom and Dad? Or maybe just get a hotel. You have insurance for this kind of thing, right? He hung up before I could respond, leaving me standing in my flooded kitchen at 3:24 in the morning, homeless in my own home. I tried my parents next. Nadine answered with immediate defensiveness, not even letting me fully explain before. Launching into excuses. Oh, honey, you know we'd normally say yes, but tomorrow is my book club brunch and I've been preparing all week. Plus, your father's back is acting up again. We simply can't handle house guests right now. Can't you just call a restoration company? They must have emergency services. Or a hotel. There are so many nice ones downtown now. Vernon got on the phone briefly, his voice gruff with sleep or indifference. I couldn't tell which anymore. Your mother's right. This is what homeowners insurance is for, Sloane. No point in disrupting everyone's weekend over a plumbing issue. Get it sorted and let us know how much it costs. Might be able to help with the deductible if it's not too much. Standing in my flooded kitchen at 3:30 in the morning, I felt something inside me break. Not dramatically, not with tears or screaming, but quietly, like a thread that had been holding too much weight for too long, finally snapping. I was beyond exhaustion, beyond grief, beyond the ability to process how thoroughly abandoned I was. My feet were numb from the cold water, my hands shaking from more than just the freezing temperature, and I realized I hadn't eaten anything substantial in over 36 hours. I waded through the kitchen looking for anything edible that wasn't in the destroyed refrigerator. The pantry yielded a package of stale crackers and a can of soup that I couldn't open because my hands were shaking too badly. I ate the crackers mechanically, standing in 3 inches of water, watching my breath cloud in the frigid air. The house felt like a tomb, and maybe that was fitting. Griffin was in an actual tomb halfway around the world, and I was in one of my own making, slowly freezing to death in the life we'd built together. The power flickered ominously, probably from water in the electrical system, and I knew I should leave. Any rational person would go to a hotel, somewhere warm and safe and dry. But I couldn't seem to make myself move. The effort required to pack again, to drive somewhere, to check in and pretend to be a functional human being felt impossible. So instead, I made the worst decision of that terrible night. I decided to check the electrical panel in the basement, thinking maybe I could at least restore heat to part of the house. The basement stairs were slick with water that had run down from above, and I gripped the railing like a lifeline. The basement itself was partially flooded, water reaching my ankles, turning boxes of stored memories into soggy garbage. Photo albums from our wedding were probably ruined. Christmas decorations we'd collected over the years, destroyed. But I couldn't process those losses on top of everything else, so I kept moving toward the electrical panel on the far wall. My phone flashlight illuminated the metal box, and I should have known better. Should have remembered that water and electricity don't mix, that grief makes you stupid, that exhaustion impairs judgment worse than alcohol. But I reached for the panel door anyway, and as my foot slipped on the wet concrete, my hand braced against the metal box for support. The shock that went through me was immediate and violent, throwing me backward into the water. My head struck something hard as I fell, probably the old workbench Griffin had been meaning to fix, and for a moment, everything went white, then black, then a strange gray in between. When I came to, I was lying in ankle-deep water, my right arm numb from the electrical shock, something warm and sticky running down the side of my face. When I touched my temple, my fingers came away dark with blood. The fall had opened a gash, just above my eyebrow, and blood was mixing with the water around me in patterns that seemed almost beautiful in my confused state. Getting to my feet took several attempts. The basement spun around me, and I had to grab the railing to keep from falling again. Each step up required enormous concentration, and halfway up I had to stop and sit, my vision going dark at the edges. By the time I reached the main floor, I was crawling more than walking, leaving bloody handprints on the walls as I pulled myself forward. The living room couch seemed miles away, but somehow I made it, collapsing onto the cushions that Griffin and I had picked out together 3 years ago, arguing playfully about the color. The house had gotten colder while I was in the basement, if that was even possible. I couldn't feel my fingers or toes anymore, and a strange lethargy was creeping through my limbs. Some distant part of my brain recognized these as symptoms of hypothermia, but I couldn't summon the energy to care. If this was how it ended, frozen and alone in the house Griffin would never come home to, maybe that was fitting. At least the pain would stop. At least I'd stop being a burden to my family, stop expecting love from people who didn't have it, to give. Then I heard it, cutting through the fog in my brain, a high-pitched beeping that wouldn't stop. The carbon monoxide detector was going off, its urgent alarm filling the house. Something was wrong with the heating system, maybe damaged by the water, maybe malfunctioning from the cold. The invisible gas was filling my home while I lay there, unable to move, unable to save myself. My phone was on the coffee table just inches from my hand, but it might as well have been on the moon. My fingers wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't close around it, wouldn't do anything but lie there useless and numb. I thought about Griffin in those moments that felt like my last. Wondered if he'd be waiting for me, wherever we go after this. Wondered if he'd be angry that I'd given up, or understanding about how hard I'd tried. I wanted to tell him about the funeral, about how his colleagues had cried, about how I'd kept his running shoes. But words were becoming impossible, thoughts fragmenting into pieces that wouldn't connect. The carbon monoxide alarm kept screaming, but it sounded farther away now, like someone else's emergency in someone else's life. Through the growing darkness, I heard pounding on the front door. Urgent, insistent banging and a voice calling out, though I couldn't make out the words. Was it real or was I hallucinating? The brain does strange things when it's dying, creates comfort that doesn't exist. But the pounding continued, and then there was a tremendous crash as the door burst open, and suddenly there were people in my house. Real people with voices and flashlights and equipment. "We've got her," someone shouted. "She's alive but unresponsive. Get the oxygen ready." Hands lifted me, and I wanted to tell them to leave me alone, that I was fine, that Griffin was waiting, but no words would come. They carried me out into the night air that felt like knives against my skin, and then I was in an ambulance with machines beeping and voices talking in medical terminology I recognized but couldn't process. "Moderate hypothermia," someone said. "Core temp at 91 degrees. We need to warm her slowly." Another voice mentioned carbon monoxide levels that made someone whistle low and worried. "Another hour and we'd be calling the coroner," they said, not knowing I could hear them, not knowing that part of me wished they'd been an hour later. The last thing I remember clearly before the hospital was one of the paramedics, a young woman with kind eyes, holding my hand and saying, "We've got you now. You're safe. You're going to be okay." She couldn't have known how foreign those words sounded, how long it had been since anyone had told me I'd be okay and meant it. Griffin used to say that every night before we fell asleep. "Everything's going to be okay, Sloane. We're going to be okay." But Griffin was gone, and nothing was okay, and now these strangers were saving a life I wasn't sure I wanted saved. Later, I would learn that Beverly Foster, my neighbor from across the street, had noticed water flowing out from under my front door and down the porch steps. She'd tried calling first, but I hadn't programmed my new number into my phone after returning from Singapore. When she heard the carbon monoxide alarm through the windows and saw the water still flowing despite no answer at the door, she'd immediately called 911. "Something just felt wrong," she would tell me later. "The house felt too quiet, too dark, and that water had to be coming from somewhere bad." Portland General Hospital's emergency room was a blur of warming blankets, IV lines, and medical professionals speaking in hushed, urgent tones. They raised my body temperature slowly, carefully, while pure oxygen pushed the carbon monoxide from my blood. The gash on my temple required 12 stitches, and they monitored my heart for irregularities from the electrical shock. Through it all, I drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes thinking I was back in Singapore with Griffin, sometimes believing this was all a nightmare I'd eventually wake from. The nurse assigned to me, Josie, had gentle hands and a voice that reminded me of my college roommate. When I was finally conscious enough to speak, she sat beside my bed and asked about my emergency contacts. Is there someone we should call? Family? Friends? The question that should have been simple felt impossibly complicated. Family? They'd made their position clear. Friends? Most had drifted away during Griffin's absence and my grief. My husband died, I heard myself say, the words still feeling foreign in my mouth. Last week, in Singapore, I just got back. Josie's expression shifted to something beyond professional sympathy. She squeezed my hand gently. Is there anyone else? Parents? Siblings? I must have laughed, or made some sound that was supposed to be laughter, because she looked concerned. They're busy, I said. They're always busy. Josie documented everything in my chart with careful attention. Later, I'd learned she'd written extensive notes about my isolation, my lack of support system, her concerns about sending me home alone. She'd even noted the text messages still visible on my phone screen when the paramedics brought me in, the family group chat with its cold dismissals and criticism. Those notes would become important in ways none of us could have predicted. Doctor. Hartley, the attending physician, was direct but kind when he reviewed my condition. You're lucky to be alive, Mrs. Sloane. The combination of hypothermia, carbon monoxide poisoning, head trauma, and electrical shock, any one of these could have been fatal. Together? He shook his head. Someone was looking out for you. I wanted to ask him who exactly was looking out for me when my husband's brain exploded, when my family abandoned me, when my house tried to kill me, but I just nodded and said nothing. What none of us knew was that Cameron Chen, a local reporter for Channel 8 News, was in the emergency room that evening, covering a different story about weather-related injuries from the cold snap. He overheard two paramedics discussing my case in the break room, not violating privacy laws, but expressing their disbelief at the circumstances. She just buried her husband overseas, one said, shaking his head. Came home to an empty airport, and a house that nearly killed her. Family wouldn't even pick her up. Can you imagine? Cameron's journalist instincts kicked in immediately. This wasn't just another burst pipe story. This was about community, family, and what happens when support systems fail. He approached the paramedics carefully, professionally, and while they couldn't share medical details, they confirmed the basic facts. A woman, recently widowed, returned from an overseas funeral to find her home flooded and freezing, nearly dying from preventable circumstances while her family refused to help. The next morning, while I was still hospitalized, Cameron tracked down Beverly Foster. She was more than willing to talk, still shaken by what she'd witnessed. I saw her arrive by rideshare yesterday afternoon, Beverly told the camera, standing in front of my still damaged house. She looked exhausted, completely broken. I meant to go check on her, bring her some soup or something. But with the storm, I got distracted. If I'd known she was alone in there with burst pipes and no heat. She trailed off, visibly upset. Cameron also interviewed the restoration company that had been called to assess the damage. The owner, clearly moved by the situation, confirmed that the house had been dangerously neglected. Pipes don't just burst instantly, he explained. This was days of freezing temperatures with no heat. Someone should have been checking on the property, especially knowing she was coming home to it. This was entirely preventable. But the real bombshell came when someone at the hospital, possibly Josie, though she'd never confirm it, shared a screenshot of the family group chat messages. Not the private medical information, but just those few messages about the airport pickup. Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? Followed by, we're busy, try Uber, and why didn't you plan better? The timestamp showed these messages came just hours before she nearly died. By 6 p.m. that evening, the story led the local news. Local woman returns from husband's overseas funeral to near tragedy, ran across the screen as Cameron delivered his report. He stood outside the hospital, explaining how Sloane Matthews had buried her husband alone in Singapore, traveled 30 hours to return home, been denied basic support from family members, and then nearly died in what should have been her safe haven. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. The news station's Facebook page exploded with comments expressing outrage and sympathy. The screenshot of the family messages went viral locally, with people sharing their own stories of family abandonment during crisis. The hashtag #NoWorries began trending, a bitter reference to my response to my family's rejection. People who'd never met me were furious on my behalf. Local businesses started reaching out to the news station immediately. Riverside Plumbing volunteered to fix all the pipe damage at no cost. Portland Restoration Services offered to handle the complete water damage restoration for free. The Marriott downtown offered a 2-week stay while repairs were completed. A meal delivery service promised 2 weeks of prepared meals. Within hours, strangers had organized more support than my family had offered in my entire life. That evening, as the 10 o'clock news aired with extended coverage, including footage of my house and interviews with neighbors, my family saw their private cruelty broadcast for all of Portland to witness. According to the night nurse who was monitoring my vitals when they arrived, they burst into my hospital room like they were being chased. Wyatt was first, his face pale and panicked. "Sloane, oh my God, we just saw the news. This is crazy. They're making it sound like we abandoned you." Nadine followed, already in full damage control mode. "This is completely blown out of proportion," she announced to the room, though only the nurse and I were there to hear it. "We had no idea the house was in that condition. Sloane knows we would have helped if we'd understood how serious things were." She was using her public voice, the one she used at charity events and book clubs, all performance and no substance. Vernon stood by the door, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He at least had the decency to look ashamed, though whether it was shame at their behavior or shame at being exposed, I couldn't tell. When the nurse stepped out to give us privacy, he finally approached my bed. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked quietly. It was the first genuine question any of them had asked since Griffin died. "The news is making us look like monsters," Wyatt said, scrolling through his phone. "My clients are texting me. Bethany's parents saw it. This is a disaster." Of course, that was his concern. Not that I'd almost died. Not that I'd buried Griffin alone, but that his professional image might be tarnished. He'd always been like this, even as children. When I'd broken my arm falling from the tree in our backyard, his first concern was whether he'd get in trouble for daring me to climb it. "You need to tell them it was a misunderstanding," Nadine said, sitting on the edge of my bed uninvited. "This is clearly just the media sensationalizing things for ratings. We're your family. We love you. This whole situation has been blown completely out of proportion." She reached for my hand, but I pulled it away, tucking it under the warming blanket. "Blown out of proportion?" I repeated, my voice hoarse from the oxygen tubes. "I almost died, Nadine, in the house you promised to check on. After traveling 30 hours from Griffin's funeral. How exactly is that blown out of proportion?" My phone began ringing incessantly with calls from extended family and family friends who'd seen the news. Aunt Patricia called Nadine directly, and I could hear her shouting through the phone from across the room. "How could you not pick up your grieving daughter from the airport? What is wrong with you?" Nadine walked into the hallway to handle the call, her face flushed with embarrassment. Wyatt's phone was equally active. "My biggest client just asked if I'm the brother from the news who told his widowed sister to take an Uber," he said, glaring at me as if this was somehow my fault. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to my reputation? I'm up for partner this year, Sloane. This could ruin everything." "Your reputation?" I stared at him, genuinely amazed. "I buried my husband alone. I nearly froze to death in my own home. And you're worried about making partner?" The heart monitor beside my bed began beeping faster, and Josie appeared immediately, taking in the scene with knowing eyes. "I think Mrs. Matthews needs rest," Josie said firmly. "Visiting hours are actually over. You'll need to leave now." She positioned herself between me and my family, a small but fierce protector. Wyatt started to protest, but Josie's expression stopped him cold. "Now please." As they gathered their things, Vernon lingered by my bed. "Sloane," he said quietly, "I know we've failed you. Not just now, but for a long time. Your mother and brother may never see it, but I do. I'm sorry." It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years, but it felt too little, too late. After they left, Josie sat with me while I cried. Not the desperate, frightened tears from earlier, but something deeper, older. "Family can be complicated," she said gently. "Sometimes the hardest thing is accepting that they can't give you what you need, not because you don't deserve it, but because they simply don't have it to give." The next morning, Dr. Hartley discussed my discharge plan with a social worker named Elena. "You'll need someone to stay with you for 48 hours minimum," he explained. "The concussion requires monitoring, and after what you've been through, you shouldn't be alone." "She won't be alone," Nadine announced, sweeping into the room with Vernon and Wyatt trailing behind. They'd clearly strategized overnight. Nadine wore her best sympathetic mother expression, the one she used when she wanted something from someone. "We've prepared our guest room. I've cleared my entire schedule to care for my daughter." Elena looked at me carefully. "Is that what you want, Sloane? You have other options if you'd prefer." The room fell silent. My family stared at me, waiting for me to play my assigned role, to smooth things over, to pretend everything was fine, for the sake of appearances. I'd done it my whole life, swallowing hurt and disappointment, making excuses for their behavior, accepting crumbs and calling it love. "What other options?" I asked, looking at Elena, not my family. "The community." "Response has been remarkable," Elena said, pulling out a folder. "The Riverside Hotel has offered a 2-week stay with room service and daily wellness checks. Several neighbors have volunteered to help with anything you need. There's a grief support group that meets at the community center, and they've reached out specifically to welcome you. A meal service has donated 2 weeks of prepared meals. The restoration company will have your house ready in 10 days. "You can't be serious," Nadine said, her voice sharp. "You'd choose strangers over your own family?" I looked at each of them. Really looked. Nadine, worried about her image. Wyatt, checking his phone even now, concerned about damage control. Vernon, silent and conflicted, unable or unwilling to stand up to his wife and son. They weren't evil people. They were just limited, capable only of loving within their own comfort zones, unable to extend themselves when it required real sacrifice or inconvenience. "Yes," I said simply. "I choose the help that comes without conditions or resentment. I choose kindness over obligation." "This is ridiculous," Wyatt exploded. "After everything we've done for you." "What exactly have you done?" I interrupted, my voice stronger than it had been in days. "When Griffin was dying, you were too busy. When I buried him, flights were too expensive. When I needed a ride, you had dinner plans. When my house flooded, your guest room was full of crafting supplies. So please tell me exactly what you've done." The silence stretched until Nadine gathered her purse. "When you come to your senses, we'll be waiting. But don't expect us to drop everything when you realize you've made a mistake." They filed out without another word, leaving me with Elena and the promise of strangers' kindness. That afternoon, the community support materialized into real faces and names. Beverly Foster came with homemade soup and a genuine apology for not checking on me sooner. Marcus and Janet from down the street offered to manage the restoration work while I recovered. Maria, a retired teacher, simply sat with me and held my hand while I talked about Griffin. The hotel suite overlooking the river was warm and clean and safe. The restoration company sent daily updates with photos, turning my disaster into something better than before. The grief support group welcomed me without judgment, offering stories of their own losses and the complicated relationships that death illuminates. 3 days into my hotel stay, I received a handwritten letter from Vernon. Unlike the family, group chat messages, or Nadine's public performances, this felt real. "I've been thinking about what you said at the hospital," he wrote. "You're right. We failed you, not just recently, but throughout your life. I don't have excuses, only regret. Your mother and Wyatt may never understand, but I want you to know that I see it now. Griffin would be proud of how you're handling this. You're stronger than we ever gave you credit for." 6 months after Griffin's death, I stood in my rebuilt kitchen, watching spring rain fall outside the window. The restoration company had done more than repair. They'd transformed. New pipes, insulated against freezing. Smart thermostats I could monitor from anywhere. A security system that would alert me to problems before they became disasters. The house that had nearly killed me was now safer than it had ever been. The grief support group met every Tuesday and Thursday at the community center. Eleanor, our facilitator, had lost her husband 3 years earlier and understood the particular loneliness of young widowhood. Grief isn't linear, she reminded us often. Some days you'll feel like you're healing, others like you're drowning all over again. Both are normal, both are necessary. Through the group, I met others navigating similar losses. Sandra, whose wife died of cancer, leaving her with 2 teenage daughters. Marcus, whose partner's motorcycle accident had shattered their plans for adoption. We became each other's emergency contacts, the people who understood why certain songs could destroy you, why grocery shopping felt like climbing Everest, why couples' advertisements made you want to scream. I returned to work after 2 months, my colleagues treating me with careful kindness. My boss, Catherine, had seen the news coverage and pulled me aside my first day back. "Whatever you need, whenever you need it," she said simply. "Grief doesn't follow business hours." That understanding made all the difference on days when I had to close my office door and cry over something as simple as Wyatt sent a formal apology email 3 months after the hospital incident, clearly written with legal help. He was worried about liability, about the public narrative, about his reputation. I responded with equal formality, acknowledging receipt, but offering nothing more. He'd made partner despite the scandal, or perhaps because of it. His firm admired his ability to handle crisis, though they didn't know the crisis was his sister almost dying. Nadine maintained her position that the media had exaggerated everything. She sent birthday and holiday cards, signed Love Mom with no personal message. I suspected Vernon made her send them. Occasionally, she'd text about seeing me somewhere in town, always with subtle criticism. "Saw you at the farmer's market. That vendor overcharged you for those tomatoes." Even from a distance, she couldn't help but judge. The first anniversary of Griffin's death approached like a storm system on weather radar, visible from far off and unavoidable. I planned to return to Singapore to visit his grave to tell him about the year without him. When I mentioned this to the grief support group, Sandra immediately offered to come with me. "No one should do that alone," she said firmly. "Not again." But I needed to go alone. Needed to prove to myself that I could. The flight felt different this time. Not the desperate rush of trying to save him or the broken journey home, but something intentional, chosen. I stayed at a small hotel near the cemetery, spending mornings at Griffin's grave and afternoons exploring places we'd planned to visit together. On the anniversary itself, I sat by his headstone from sunrise to sunset. I told him about the house repairs, about Beverly's soup, about the scholarship I was creating in his name. I told him about setting boundaries with my family, about finding new people who showed up without being asked. "You always said I was stronger than I knew," I whispered to the marble stone. Turns out you were right. The Singapore cemetery had added a small bench near Griffin's grave, donated by his former colleagues. A plaque read, "For those who travel far to remember." I met Mitchell there, Griffin's co-worker who'd called me that terrible day. He brought flowers and shared stories about Griffin I'd never heard, moments of kindness and brilliance that happened in his life away from me. It helped, knowing he'd been happy there, that his last months had meaning beyond being prelude to tragedy. Flying home, I felt different. Not healed. Healing doesn't mean forgetting or stopping grief, but I felt purposeful. The scholarship fund had grown beyond my initial investment, with donations from strangers touched by the news story. Local businesses contributed, turning personal tragedy into community action. The first recipient would be announced next month, a young woman studying environmental engineering in Japan. The plane landed at Portland International on a Thursday evening. This time, I'd arranged my own transportation, a rental car waiting, at the agency. But when I reached baggage claim, Beverly stood there with a handmade sign reading, "Welcome home, Sloane." Behind her were Sandra and Marcus from Grief Group, Maria from down the street, and Elena, the social worker who'd helped me choose myself over obligation. "You didn't think we'd let you come home alone, did you?" Beverly asked, pulling me into A hug that smelled like cinnamon and safety. Real family shows up, remember? As we drove home together, their cars forming a kind of convoy, I thought about the strange mathematics of loss and gain. I'd lost Griffin, would always carry that. Absence like a shadow. I'd lost the illusion that DNA guaranteed love or support. But I'd gained something too, a chosen family built from kindness rather than obligation, from showing up rather than sharing genes. That night, in my rebuilt house filled with friends and neighbors, we shared a meal Maria had coordinated. Everyone brought something, creating a feast from contribution rather than burden. Stories were shared, tears and laughter mixing naturally. No one checked their phones for more important obligations. No one suggested I should be over it by now. No one made my grief about their discomfort. The James Griffin Henderson Memorial Scholarship for International Education launched officially 1 year after his death. The announcement ceremony took place at Portland State University, in the same library where we'd first met. I'd insisted on that location, needing the symmetry of beginning something meaningful where everything had started. The university president spoke about the importance of supporting students abroad, never knowing that the scholarship specifically covered emergency family travel and crisis support. This scholarship exists because of love and loss, I told the assembled crowd, my voice steady despite the tears threatening. My husband died alone in Singapore while on a work assignment. I couldn't afford to bring family with me for support. No student should face tragedy overseas without the means to have loved ones beside them. This fund ensures they won't have to. The first recipient, Angela Chen, stood beside me as I presented the certificate. She was planning to study sustainable architecture in Tokyo, bright-eyed and ambitious like Griffin had been. This scholarship includes emergency provisions, I explained to her privately later. If anything happens, anything at all, you have resources. You won't be alone. The local media covered the event, Cameron Chen doing a follow-up story about how tragedy had transformed into purpose. This time, my family saw it coming and stayed away. Except Vernon, who sat in the back row, offering a small nod of support when our eyes met. He'd contributed to the fund anonymously, though I recognized his handwriting on the donation card. 2 weeks after the scholarship announcement, Nadine called. Not a text, an actual phone call. "Your father says you've been having lunch," she began without preamble. "He seems to think we should talk." Her voice carried the same tone she used when forced to apologize as a child, resentful and perfunctory. "What would we talk about, Mom?" I asked, genuinely curious what she thought needed discussing. "This whole situation has gotten out of hand," she said. "The family looks terrible. People at the club whisper when I walk by. Wyatt lost 2 clients. Your father mopes around like someone died." "Someone did die," I reminded her. "Griffin died, remember? My husband?" "Of course I remember," she snapped. "But that was over a year ago, Sloane. At some point, you need to move forward and stop punishing us for one badly timed misunderstanding." One badly timed misunderstanding, that's how she'd rewritten the story. Not abandonment, not cruelty, not a lifetime of being prioritized below social obligations and personal comfort. Just a misunderstanding, like she'd forgotten to pick up milk or missed a phone call. "I'm not punishing anyone," I said calmly. "I'm protecting myself. There's a difference." "From your own family? That's dramatic, even for you. Even for you." 3 words that summarized my entire childhood. Even for you, when I cried over my broken arm while they attended Wyatt's game. Even for you, when I asked for help with college costs. Even for you, when I needed support after my husband's death. "Goodbye, Mom," I said and hung up. She didn't call back. Wyatt reached out a month later through his lawyer, of all things. A formal letter suggesting mediation to resolve family disputes and restore harmony. I almost laughed at the corporate language applied to human relationships. My response through my own lawyer was simple. No mediation necessary. No disputes to resolve. Please respect my boundaries. The second anniversary of Griffin's death arrived with less fanfare but no less grief. Sadness had evolved from a crushing weight to a carried stone, always present but manageable. I visited Singapore again, this time with Sandra from Grief Group. She visited her wife's grave in California while I was gone, understanding the need for solitary remembrance while ensuring I wasn't truly alone. Griffin's grave had weathered beautifully, the marble softening slightly, looking less harsh against the green grass. Fresh flowers lay there from Mitchell and the team, maintaining their promise to remember him. I spent 3 days in Singapore this time, visiting places Griffin had loved, eating at his favorite hawker stalls, existing in the space between memory and presence. On the flight home, I read Vernon's latest letter. He'd taken to writing monthly, long handwritten pages exploring his own understanding of our family's dysfunction. "I was a coward," he wrote, "always choosing peace over truth, silence over confrontation. I let your mother's need for control and Wyatt's demand for attention eclipse your quieter needs. I see now that quiet doesn't mean less important, gentle doesn't mean less valuable." He'd started therapy, he wrote, trying to understand his own patterns. The therapist asked me to describe each of my children. I spent 20 minutes on Wyatt's achievements, his personality, his challenges. "For you, I said you were good, never any trouble." She asked me if I saw the problem with that description. "I'm beginning to." I wrote back this time, acknowledging his growth while maintaining my boundaries. Change was possible, I conceded, but trust required time and consistency. "I'm glad you're doing the work," I wrote. "Maybe someday we can build something new. Not what was, but what could be." 3 years after Griffin's death, I stood in my garden, the roses blooming magnificently. Beverly worked beside me, our Thursday tradition of gardening and tea. She'd become the mother figure I'd never had, offering support without judgment, presence without condition. "These are award-worthy," she said, touching a particularly spectacular bloom. "You should enter the state fair." Griffin always said, "That?" I replied, and for the first time, mentioning him brought a smile instead of tears. That evening, the grief support group met for our regular session. We'd lost some members to healing and time, gained others fresh in their pain. Eleanor had asked me to co-facilitate, recognizing that my journey might help others navigate theirs. "You've learned something valuable," she said. "That family isn't about blood, it's about choosing to show up." 5 years after Griffin's death, I married again. Not because I'd forgotten him or moved on in the way people expect, but because the heart's capacity for love isn't limited by loss. David was a widower from our grief support group, his wife having died of leukemia 3 years before Griffin's aneurysm. We understood each other's shadows, the way certain dates would always sting, how first loves shape but don't prevent second chances. The wedding was small, held in my backyard garden among the roses that had finally won blue ribbons. At the state fair, Beverly walked me down the aisle, wearing the corsage I'd made from my prize-winning blooms. Sandra stood as my maid of honor, Marcus and Elena as witnesses. The grief support group filled the chairs, people who'd seen me at my absolute worst, and loved me anyway. Vernon attended, sitting quietly in the back, having earned his place through 3 years of consistent monthly lunches and genuine change. He'd divorced Nadine 2 years earlier, finally choosing truth over peace. "I spent 40 years enabling her behavior," he'd told me. "I won't spend whatever years I have left doing the same." Neither Nadine nor Wyatt were invited. They'd become footnotes in my story rather than main characters, people I might pass in a grocery store and nod at politely, nothing more. Wyatt had reached out once when his own marriage fell apart, suddenly understanding loneliness, but I couldn't be his comfort after he'd denied me mine. During the reception, David made a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "Sloane and I both know that second love doesn't replace first love," he said. "Griffin and Amy are part of our story, part of why we understand each other. We're not here despite our losses, but because of how we've chosen to honor them by living fully the fight." Griffin Henderson's scholarship had expanded to 3 universities, supporting 20 students annually. Each recipient received not just financial support, but mentorship, connection to a network of people who understood that adventures abroad could turn tragic, that preparation meant more than packing lists. Angela Chen, our first recipient, now served on the board, having completed her degree and returned safely. One recipient, Thomas, had needed the emergency provisions when his father had a heart attack while Thomas was studying in Germany. The fund flew his mother to him, covered temporary housing, provided support when insurance failed. "You saved us," his mother wrote to me. Not just financially, but knowing someone understood that this fund existed because someone else had suffered alone. 3 months after my wedding to David, I received an unexpected call. Nadine had been hospitalized after a fall. Wyatt was traveling for business and couldn't return immediately. The hospital needed a family member to make medical decisions. Despite everything, I was still listed as her emergency contact after Vernon, who was traveling himself. I went, not out of obligation, but from human decency. She looked smaller in the hospital bed, frailer than the imposing figure of my childhood. When she woke, she seemed surprised to see me. "You came," she said, voice weak from medication. "Someone had to," I replied simply. "Wyatt said he'll be here tomorrow. His meeting is too important to reschedule." Even now, even broken and alone, she made excuses for him. "Of course he did," I said, and something in my tone must have finally reached her because tears formed in her eyes. "I don't understand you," she whispered. "You were always so difficult, wanting things we couldn't give." "I wanted you to care," I said gently. "That's all. Just to matter as much as dinner plans or social obligations." She turned away, unable or unwilling to engage with that truth. I stayed until the nurse confirmed she was stable, signed the necessary papers, and left. Wyatt could handle the rest. It was the last time I saw her. A year later, Vernon called to tell me Nadine had passed suddenly from a stroke. I attended the funeral, sitting with Vernon, who'd maintained care despite their divorce. Wyatt delivered a eulogy full of revised history, painting a picture of a devoted mother I'd never known. I didn't correct him. Everyone grieves the relationship they wished they'd had. After the service, Wyatt approached me. Success had aged him poorly, stress lines mapping his face. "Thank you for coming," he said stiffly. "Mom would have appreciated it." "Would she?" I asked, genuinely curious. He started to deliver some platitude, then stopped. "Probably not," he admitted. "She never understood why you couldn't just pretend everything was fine." "Because everything wasn't fine," I said. "And pretending killed parts of me I've spent years trying to resurrect." He nodded, uncomfortable with emotional honesty, even now. "I heard about your scholarship program and your remarriage. I'm glad you're doing well." "I am," I said. "I really am. And I was. Not because I'd forgotten the pain or forgiven the abandonment, but because I'd learned that family isn't about DNA or obligation. It's about choosing each other again and again, especially when it's inconvenient or difficult. It's Beverly bringing soup every Sunday, Sandra checking in on grief anniversaries, David holding me when random Tuesdays brought unexpected tears, the grief support group celebrating my joys and cushioning my sorrows. As I stood in my garden that evening, David beside me, surrounded by friends who'd become family, I thought about Griffin one more time. "You were right," I whispered to the evening sky. "I was stronger than I knew, strong enough to lose you, strong enough to survive abandonment, strong enough to choose love over blood, kindness over obligation, truth over comfortable lies." The roses bloomed around us, magnificent in the setting sun, proof that beautiful things can grow from broken soil if tended with genuine care. My chosen family gathered for dinner, voices mixing with laughter and shared stories. No one would leave early for more important obligations. No one would suggest I plan better or try harder or expect less. This was what family really meant. Not perfect people, but present ones. Not those who share your blood, but those who show up when life bleeds you dry. Griffin's death had taught me about loss. My birth family's abandonment had taught me about limitations. But these people, this chosen family, had taught me about the infinite capacity for love when it comes without conditions. The scholarship students sometimes asked me how I'd survived such loss, such betrayal. I always told them the same thing. You survive by understanding that requesting help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. That family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes it's who shows up when you text, "Can someone pick me up?" and actually comes. That love isn't measured in DNA percentages, but in presence during absence, in kindness during crisis, in choosing each other when choosing away, would be easier. If you've ever felt abandoned by those who should love you most, know this. Your worth isn't determined by their capacity to see it. Sometimes the family we're born into can't give us what we need, not from malice but from limitation. The miracle isn't in changing them, but in finding those who already understand how to love without conditions. They're out there, waiting to become your chosen family. You just have to be brave enough to choose them back.